Hello and welcome to another exciting episode. Exciting, educational, inspirational, optimistic, challenging episode. I'm really excited about today's episode. I'm always excited about all of them. It's possible I'm easily excited. That has to be faced. But I think you'll really enjoy today's show. Just before we start, I just want to talk about the amazing company that is My Energy. Now, yesterday, I went up to Grimsby in North Lincolnshire, which is, for those of you outside the UK, it's on the northeast coast of the UK, very near Hull. Grimsby was once the premier, the number one, the biggest fishing port in the world. Not just the UK or Europe, the world. I'm talking before I was born, so a while ago. And it gradually had a demise, and we basically fished all the cod out in the North Sea. There weren't any left. That's always a bit of a problem. Or very few left, and they went further afield to Iceland. There was a big hoo-ha with disagreements with the Icelandic nation, and should we be fishing around them, taking their fish? Kind of felt like they had a point at the time. I didn't like to say. Anyway, there was a terrible demise of the fishing industry and huge unemployment and poverty and deprivation. Really sad. Once great thriving town just sort of fell on itself, which is we have a long history of that in the UK for many different reasons. The mining towns, the old steel making towns, a lot of change since the early industrial revolution, which we were very much part of the very beginning of the early industrial revolution in this country. A thing we can easily forget. History, if there's any young people listening, is very important. It's important to know the backstory. Anyway, this area now is seeing a phenomenal resurgence. I mean, genuinely extraordinary resurgence of economic activity. And it's 100% down to new technologies, to offshore wind and many other things, which I will mention, including very, very critically importantly, My Energy. But there is this huge resurgence of stuff going on that's really changing. And it's quite extraordinary to see, because for so long, Hull, Humberside, the Humber River, either side of it, North Lincolnshire on one side, Yorkshire on the other, and Humberside, all that stuff, it was a real, in the 70s, 80s, even the 90s, it was really a very poor area. And it's really changing. It's extraordinary. Very high employment, well-paid, technical, complicated jobs. We're going up there again soon to see how wind turbines are made. I'm allowed to help make a wind turbine blade. They're quite big. There's a hint. So that was really exciting. So we went up there. Okay, tiny bit of history and backstory. 5 years ago, I first met Jordan, who is one of the co-founder of My Energy, in a wind-blown garden in Orkney where they had a Zappi charger. And it was all fine. It was all working, but it was put up on a temporary post at the time. And the post kept falling over. So I had to have my foot to support the post. It was very early days for them. I believe she said there were either 7 or 8 of them working in the company at that time. There's now 403. And they're just building this massive factory with a fantastic roof. It's only a steel frame at the moment, but a fantastic roof of a number of angled roofs, like a sawtooth. It's like it goes up and down, and that's all for solar on the roof, and then a window vertically, which brings light into the factory. Damn it! That was my alarm to tell me I've got a cake in the oven, but it's okay. I've got time to tell you this before the cake burns. I have to keep that in. So really exciting. They're really expanding, and what we saw yesterday, by the time you hear this, I still don't know. I better not say anything. We just saw their new product, which is amazing, and I really want one. And I don't know when this is going to go out, so I don't know when they're finally releasing the information, because they still haven't announced it. I better not say, which is frustrating. But if you go to myenergi.com, myenergi.com, and they have released it, all the information is there, and you'll love it. It's incredible. I know a huge number of people are going to want this fabulous new product, and all the peripheral connecting I'm going to say connecting tissue, because it's like a beast. It's like an animal that you need to connect all this stuff together to make sense, and to not only help yourself in your own house, but to help the entire energy network. It's just critically important what they're doing. And it was so exciting to see how well they're doing in really challenging economic and international supply chain constraint problems, challenges. They're doing incredibly well. And such a vibrant company with so many young people, so many women working there, so many very diverse workforce, really, proper industrial success story, wherever it was in the world. But the fact that it's in the UK is, I have to say, very refreshing in the current climate with the current administration. Who knows, by the time you hear this, who will be in the current administration, or if there even will be one. We've just had a very big sacking today, so it's all very exciting. Enough of that nonsense. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about Carbon Brief. Now, some of you are going to be very familiar with this. Carbon Brief is a UK-based website covering the latest developments in climate science, climate policy, and energy policy, and it's always fascinating, real deep dives into really complex problems with really skillful science writers who are primarily always scientists first, and they've gone into kind of journalism second. And my guest today is certainly one of those. So Dr. Simon Evans started out life as a chemist at Oxford University, then went on to study. He explains what he did. I'm not going to say, because I'll say the wrong discipline. And he's just a delightful person to talk to, two, fascinating, with really clear, deep insights into the shift in public understanding, and the shift in the technology we're using, the importance of that shift, the critically important thing that we really need to get on with it, do it quickly. Really, really interesting conversation. Desperate to get him back on the show. I could talk to him for days. I could listen to him for days, which is what is really much more important. No, really good. So that's it. Dr. Simon Evans from Carbon Brief. I'm going to put a load of links in the show notes for this, because there's some really interesting stuff he refers to, and I've got all links for that. Really hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you after this lovely podcast. Simon, thank you very much for joining us. And also, as always, I quite like to be transparent about this. I had messed up the arrangements. Let's just get that out of the way. And I just want to say you've been very, very gracious and patient with me. So thank you very much for adjusting to that. But I'd love you to just go briefly over what you do, or where, sort of, in a sense, like if you can do a potted history of how you got to doing what you do, because you're quite clever. And whenever I meet people who are quite clever, I'm always fractionally intimidated, even at my age. So you've got proper qualifications. You went to school, you did homework, you're clever. I didn't do it. I was expelled when I was 16, so I don't have that advantage. So can you just do a sort of quick potted history to put us in the picture?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me on. It's great to chat. So where to start? I mean, I guess I was one of those people that didn't have ambitions. Some people, you go to school and they want to be a fireman, or a rocket scientist, or whatever it might be. And I never had any of those things. I was, I guess, intellectually curious. I found the world interesting, and I literally had no idea what I was going to do with that. So I went off to university and studied chemistry, and thought, well, that's pretty cool. Still not really sure what I'm going to do. So, and I guess, I thought maybe I'll do a PhD, but I sort of thought, well, I don't want to just slip into that. I mean, it's a big commitment, a PhD, 3 or 4 years. And I didn't want to just end up doing that because I couldn't think of anything better to do, which seemed like that would probably not really be the thing. So I took a year to kind of think about it, and I ended up in a really, really fascinating work for a year, basically working for one of my oldest friend's dads at the University of Sussex on a project which is all about chemical and biological weapons.
Wow.
And yeah, and at the time, kind of zooming back to where would we be, like 2003, it was around the time of the build up to the Second Iraq War.
Yeah.
And obviously it was all very much kind of dodgy dossier, Chemical Alley, all of that stuff. And it was, that was exactly the stuff that project was all about. And, it was tracking what's going on in the world in relation to chemical and biological weapons. So it was absolutely amazing place to work. And it also had an element of kind of journalism about it. They had a kind of a quarterly bulletin, which was kind of a diary of everything in the world that was happening. So I did that for a while, but during that year, I just decided, let's go for it. I'm going to do a PhD. So I went back to university and studied biochemistry, and lots of good things to say about that. Obviously, it's a great insight into how the world of science actually works, which I think is very much not the way people imagine it to be. People imagine, I don't know, scientists having eureka moments and all sorts of stuff. I think that there's a kind of a trope around science reporting where, we've always thought the world works in this particular way until now, and this breakthrough discovery from some scientists
changes everything.
Yeah, and obviously it's very much not like that. It's kind of incremental hours and days and weeks and months and years spent at lab benches and computers, going through experimental results, trying to work out what the hell it all means. And that was interesting, but I realized that actually that kind of level of commitment and that kind of dogged pursuit of new understanding and new knowledge wasn't actually for me. Of course, academia is an incredibly challenging career as well, and I have absolutely massive respect for all of the people that choose that. Getting funding for it, constantly applying for grants, writing papers. It's such a competitive world. But what I realized in doing the PhD was that I actually really enjoyed reading about other people's interesting discoveries. I wasn't so much for slaving away at a lab bench, but I loved reading about what people found when they did that. And I also enjoyed kind of putting that in context, like what's the story here? How does this fit with the kind of broader knowledge? And so weirdly, a kind of strange admission, I'm not sure how many scientists would agree, but I actually quite enjoyed writing my PhD thesis. Because it was very much that kind of synthesis of, there's kind of a literature review. Where does my research fit into the sphere of knowledge in that very tiny little niche of the world that I was looking at?
Yeah.
And so I kind of went off. I did a placement in this very amazing organization called the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And most people haven't heard of it. Hopefully most MPs know about it. They basically produce briefings for MPs and peers on scientific and technical matters that might be relevant to legislation or policy discussions. And they have lots of interns, all funded by research councils. And I was lucky enough to get a placement there. And then, and that was kind of like writing a long feature article over the space of 3 months. And during that time, I managed to find a job as a science journalist with something called the ENDS Report, which has been going for kind of 30 or 40 years and was kind of one of the original environmental journals when environment policy first became a thing. And I remember in my interview that the editor at the time, Nick Schoon, said to me, well, that's great. You've written this feature article about whatever it was. I can't remember the details right now, but if you came to work for me at the ENDS Report, you would need to write one of those, but in about 2 weeks. Do you think you could do that? And I was like, well, I mean, probably. I don't know. I hope so. And luckily, he and I didn't have any journalistic training, of course. That's the other thing that was amazing about that. And they put their faith in me, and off I went. And I basically walked into that job and kind of eavesdropped on my colleagues' conversations, and I would sit there listening to them having their phone calls, interviewing sources and scientists, and being like, right, okay, taking notes. This is how you meant to do it, and basically picked it up as I went. And that was the beginning of my career in journalism, which I've been doing ever since. And I was there for a number of years, and then found a job at Carbon Brief, and I've been there since 2014.
Right. Because that's where that I know you from, and I think I would have been reading articles you were writing from the very early days of you being there, and I was always very impressed with it. And I just want, in that journey, I'm sort of assuming with your generation in particular, there was a kind of base level understanding that there might be one or two slight issues with the way that the human race is interacting with its planet. that was sort of an understood given, because in a sense my generation kind of learnt about that I have no idea. There was never it wasn't a discussion point when I was a kid. So my parents never talked about, the environment or pollution or anything like that. That kind of came at a later stage. But I'm assuming that was sort of in the ether, as it were, of your life from very early on.
I mean, I think in theory that should have been the case, but
Right.
but to be completely honest, I certainly remember, reading in the paper and a bit seeing on the news about kind of the Montreal Protocol and the ozone layer, and aerosol spray cans and how terrible they were for the environment, and that kind of stuff I remember well. But I honestly don't remember from school, for example, learning about climate change.
No.
I mean, I assume that we probably must have. But I think it probably was something more that I picked up, in later life at university. Right. I used to read New Scientist, for example, very regularly. And, you just kind of read and, absorb all of that stuff. And then, I guess, a lot of the stuff I've learned actually on the job. So, at the ENDS report covering new science relating to climate change.
Yeah.
Writing about the ClimateGate so-called scandal back in 2009 that many of your listeners might remember.
Right. Yeah.
But that was one of my kind of early exposures to kind of the world of climate science and the kind of misinformation around that, which is obviously so prevalent back then, and it had become much less prevalent. But of course, this year we've seen a kind of resurgence in,
big one.
bad reporting and kind of bad faith arguments, I guess.
Yeah, because I mean, so can you explain? So for people who are not aware of Carbon Brief, which I think is an amazing organ, I don't know if that's the right term, because you can't really say magazine anymore. Publication, thing. What do I call it? I don't even know.
Publication, website, whatever you like.
Yeah. Anyway, but can you explain what the kind of the sort of underlying ethos is? I mean, just for example, the kind of the motto that we use on the Fully Charged show is "Stop burning stuff," which we absolutely accept is not going to happen and is daft, but it's quite a good target to aim for. If you can find a technology that doesn't burn anything, that's generally not a bad thing. There may be side effects. I mean, is there a sort of overarching, I don't know what, journey that Carbon Brief is on, and if so, what is it?
So actually, Carbon Brief was started around the time of the ClimateGate scandal, and I'm thinking back to that time, newspaper coverage, particularly of climate science, was often very poor. Yeah. There was often kind of prominent platforming of climate skeptics who were given equal space to climate scientists, actual experts versus lobbyists, and it was a very, very strange thing that continued for many years, including on the BBC. And the BBC went through a kind of a series of soul-searching reviews where they thought about whether that was effectively false balance, which they decided that it was.
Yeah.
And so Carbon Brief was kind of formed in that time as originally as a kind of a fact-checking website to try and correct the record, and also as a place to kind of a safe space, if you like, for climate scientists to write about and to talk about their work without fear of being kind of quoted out of context or misquoted even, which at that time was definitely a problem. And then over the years, Carbon Brief's really evolved into essentially we just do in-depth journalism about climate science, climate policy, and energy, but very much as it relates to climate change. Obviously, the energy sector being 3/4 or 80%, whatever it is, of global emissions, and therefore absolutely vital if we're going to tackle warming.
Yeah, and I mean that. I think it might be worth just refreshing our memory about ClimateGate, about it was the use of the word trick, I believe, wasn't it? Was that the word? Because the kind of it was a fossil fuel lobbyist's dream moment. Oh my God, we've caught them! That story of that. So it was Norwich University.
The University of East Anglia, which is based in Norwich,
In Norwich. So, sorry, yes, and they their system was hacked. Basically, people hacked documents and emails from them, didn't they?
Yeah, so effectively what happened was the University of East Anglia is responsible for one of the world's kind of leading records of global temperature,
right?
Along with the Met Office in Exeter. And yeah, their emails were hacked. There's never been a kind of conclusive discovery of who exactly did do that.
Right.
I think people have speculated about whether it might have been the Russians, for example. And it was obviously, it was very clearly timed that it happened just before the Copenhagen Climate Summit. All of that was released, and it was part of that deliberate kind of sowing of doubt about the facts of climate science, with the aim of derailing climate action, action to actually tackle emissions. And the thing that people remember about that was this use of a trick. And effectively, it was a bunch of scientists talking in an email chain about how to deal. It's just the kind of the nitty gritty, getting your hands dirty, actually dealing with data, which is what a lot of science is all about. And they had a kind of a neat way of dealing with some problem with the data. Right. Let's say there was like I can't remember some kind of inconsistency in the data which they couldn't explain, and they found that they found a way to deal with that, and they one of them described it as a trick, and that obviously meant that they were deliberately misinforming, misleadingly kind of manipulating the data to try and show that there was global warming when in reality there was none. And of course, many efforts have happened since then. That there was the Berkeley Earth thing, which was actually set up as a kind of fully independent global temperature records reconstruction to say, okay, well, people don't trust people like the University of East Anglia. What happens if we get in these completely independent data scientists? And one of my colleagues at Carbon Brief, Seek Hausfather, was actually involved in that work. They basically brought in people that didn't necessarily know about it, but were really top-notch data scientists. Let's see if we can do this and do it in a different way, not necessarily following what everyone else has done before. And lo and behold, they found, exactly as the University of East Anglia and others had said, that the last 30 years has seen very dramatic global warming, and that we're currently facing heat unprecedented in hundreds of thousands of years, effectively.
Yeah. I mean, my purely anecdotal observation of that was the 2 days this year when the UK went over 40 degrees centigrade. And I've spent quite a lot of time in Australia, and I've written some books while I was living in Australia, and which required 2 damp hand towels that I keep in the fridge, and I put either side of the keyboard. And while I'm thinking, I put my hands on those because I'm sweating so much. And this is in Queensland tropical temperatures of 40 plus degrees centigrade, 100% humidity. I love it, but it's quite an impact on a Brit. And then I type for a bit, and then I'm dripping, and I've got to mop everything up. That happened to me in this country for a whole day, when I was in the coolest room I could find in the shade with the doors open with a bit of a breeze. And it was, I've lived in this house 30 years. It's never been anywhere near that. Now, that is 2 days, could be a freak for all those things, but you go, that is just a little bell was ringing going, I don't know how exceptional those 2 days were, but it was very, very noticeable this summer.
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting living through that. And, of course, one of the things that I was reflecting on as we were experiencing those record hot days this summer was actually just almost exactly a year previous to that, we had incredible flash flooding across large parts of the southern England.
That's right, south and east England, of course.
Particularly in London. And our house very nearly flooded. It came within kind of millimeters of flooding. Lots of people in the local area, and this is in Walthamstow in East London. Right. Lots of people around here actually were flooded. We were very relieved that we didn't buy one of those houses we'd looked at on Brook Road, which is named Brook Road for a reason. We realised. But it's really shocking. Our neighbours next door have been here 50 years. They said they'd never seen anything like that. Right. They've certainly never seen anything like the heat wave that we had this year. And I think even though, we talk about climate change all the time, I write about it professionally, so I'm thinking about it constantly. And even though in the days running up to the UK's heat wave, we'd been tracking coverage of the heat waves happening across Europe, and I'd been collecting kind of front page newspaper pictures of, from newspapers around the world with all these dramatic pictures of wildfires in Spain and France and so on. And even despite seeing all of that, I was still shocked when it actually happened here too, and we had those dramatic fires again, in London. You kind of think, geez, that doesn't happen in the UK, but apparently it does now.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it was exceptional, and very. One of the things that I find that we found fascinating is if we do a show about a new small lightweight electric city car, it'll get 500,000 views in a few days. And if we do an episode where the word climate is in the title of the episode, and it doesn't matter really what it is, but if we've just discovered this over the years, then the views are minuscule. It's an absolute. It's quite interesting how, in a way, it's become a toxic word, and it's become sort of loaded, and it's just extraordinary because I think our audience generally, and we've got a very global audience for Fully Charged. We're only around 27-28% of our viewers are in the UK. The rest are all over the world. But it seems to be a global phenomenon and also I think people don't want to be punished. I think that's the really interesting aspect of how you communicate this stuff, because kind of we've all got to change, and that always follows with, but I do need to fly sometimes to do my job, or I've got half my family in Australia. I suppose I could row there, but there's all this, and there's something I've just experienced recently is the guilt hammer, or the accusation of hypocrisy hammer, is always just being held above you by fossil fuel lobbyists, by people who think it's, climate change deniers. You're worse because you've been on, you've had a log fire, you've been in a plane, your car is made of oil and powered by burning coal. All those things, those arguments, which I'm sure you're very familiar with as well. But I'm just interested to know how, if you have any opinions on how you can communicate climate, because it isn't our remit. We're not talking about climate change. We're really talking about technology that hopefully burns less stuff and is less harmful. I've always gone for air quality, local air quality. That's across the spectrum argument. People generally will accept 500 diesel cars in the middle of a city ticking over in a traffic jam. It's not a good idea. That's not a hard argument to win. But the climate argument it still seems to be very contentious, and a lot of denial, a lot of head in the sand attitudes.
Yeah, I think you touched on a few really interesting and very true points in there. I think obviously the genius of something like Fully Charged is that it's about solutions, but actually it's not really about solutions. It's about how the new thing, which is electric cars, is actually, it's just much cooler and more fun, and
there's that aspect.
It is a solution to climate change, but that's not why it's interesting and exciting. So people love solutions. They particularly like solutions if they also tick a lot of other boxes. So people like renewables. They're very popular. They're clean, they're cheap, they boost our energy security. And by the way, they cut our emissions, right? So people like it if they can have a free, what feels like a free lunch. And I think it's true that people don't like. I don't know. Watching the kind of the climate debate, obviously there's still to this day, a kind of constituency of people that downplay the risks of climate change, and kind of effectively, deliberately or unconsciously, kind of push back against the idea that it's a problem. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you like, there's also a kind of a growing constituency of so-called doomers who are basically like, the climate scientists aren't telling us the truth. It's much worse than we thought. And
right, yes, okay.
and it's kind of equally kind of based on misreading or kind of misinterpreting or deliberately kind of taking out of context the actual science,
Right.
and as with climate skeptics, kind of refusing to listen to the actual experts, and when they say, I think you'll find that's not quite right, or whatever it might be. So so there's obviously a certain appeal to the kind of nihilistic kind of take on climate.
Yeah.
It isn't just that people don't want to be kind of made to feel bad about the world. Like some people really, really like that.
They want to be made to feel a lot worse about the world. That is because I think I've had hints of that in some of the comments, which is, I've never argued that electric cars are the solution. They're part of a bigger picture, and one of the things they lead to is questioning where our energy comes from and how we use it, and what sacrifices we have to make to have a stable supply. All those things. I think electric cars are a kind of catalyst for change, if you like. But I mean, they're certainly not. If we just replace 31 million petrol and diesel cars with 31 million electric cars, we kind of utterly miss the point of the whole thing.
I think that's very fair, and that's definitely a criticism we see as well when we write about electric vehicles. Well, what about congestion? What about mining and so on? I think a lot of that is overplayed. Like all this, like, oh my god, you might need to mine some lithium or cobalt to drive electric cars, and it's like, guys, have you seen what happens where they extract oil and gas and coal? It's not exactly clean. And also, we're talking about stocks versus flows. I mean, I think a lot of people misunderstand this. Like, you buy an electric car and you need a small amount of lithium for it, and then that's your electric car. You just plug it in and refuel it with electrons. But if you have a petrol car, you need a constant flow of petrol every single time you drive it, and that happens in perpetuity. Where rather than just at the beginning when you buy it, you build the electric car. So I don't know, but coming back to your point about we can't just replace all the cars with other cars. I mean, I think that one of the other interesting areas with climate change is this constant kind of what are the kind of personal actions? How can people as individuals act? And I think the fundamental thing that most frustrates me about that conversation is that it just totally misses what I kind of think about as like choice architecture, which is, I don't know, I'm not sure if this is like a recognized term, but effectively what I mean by that is, certain things we can just choose to do in our lives. We can choose to become vegetarian, for example, or choose to become vegan. But, some people simply don't have the option to not have a car because of where they live, because of the availability of public transport, because of the way that their city is designed. You look at, sprawling suburban cities in the US, somewhere like Los Angeles, and you compare it to somewhere like Barcelona, for example, in Spain. And the choice that people as individuals have as to whether they drive or not is shaped to such a degree by the city, the built environment, the choices that they have available to them. And, in the same way as, the availability of vegan alternatives to milk, vegan alternatives to meat, all of those things have become more available. And that gives people more opportunity, more ability to take choices as they wish, that may also have a benefit for the climate.
Yeah. And then the other one that I've becoming increasingly skeptical / doubting / critical of is the notion of the personal carbon footprint. And I'm just very suspicious of where that came from, because the more I think about it, the more it makes a huge amount of sense for a fossil fuel company to say, your personal carbon footprint could be reduced if you use a different washing up liquid, not if you but can carry on burning the fossil fuel we sell you. Don't even consider that for a moment. Carry on having a gas heater in your house. Carry on burning oil in your central heating system. All those things. But then it's your fault. It's like plastic waste. Because I'm old enough to have had milk in bottles made of glass that we used again. And it was so boring. It was never a topic of conversation. And then you could buy milk in a plastic thing. And I went, oh, that's quite easy. And then you throw the plastic thing away. And that's my fault. No, it's not. It's the fault of the plastics industry that introduced plastic bottles that you throw away and you use once. It's entirely their fault. It's not my fault. I don't want the plastic. That's the personal carbon footprint.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question. Like, whose responsibility is it?
Yeah,
Um, if you talk to oil companies, for example, so companies like Shell and BP have long done kind of energy scenarios, like what's the outlook for energy demand, and obviously, you can see for obvious reasons why they might do that internally,
yeah,
but a lot of those companies have historically published their scenarios, and one of the things that I remember interviewing one of the people at Shell that was responsible for that work about so, Mr. Shell, let's call him that. Your scenario seems to have, ever increasing demand for energy, and a lot of that is stuff that you're going to sell.
yeah.
And what's that all about? Do you think that's a reasonable assumption? Whose responsibility is that? And that, his line was very much. You can go back and look at this in our archives if you like.
Yeah.
I think it's Jeremy Bentham, if people want to look it up.
Oh,
And
yes, I've heard of his name. Yeah, yeah,
his argument was very much like, it's about the tail and the dog and who's wagging it, and
yeah,
effectively that they as fossil fuel companies are nobly just meeting the demand that is out there, and they
yeah,
have like absolutely no control over the demand. They're just meeting a need that people are expressing, and that we just kind of know that isn't really the case.
yeah,
Similar things like if you build extra roads, then demand increases. If you
yeah,
produce more oil, then demand increases, and so supply and demand go in both directions. And I think
yeah,
it's
yeah.
convenient for some people to kind of pretend otherwise, but it's very much the case.
No, I absolutely agree. I'm going to try and find all these things and put them in links in the in the description box for this episode because I'd forgotten about him. But one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, because that's a fairly recent article you've written about the UK energy price, which is gone all up all over the world. But I just early this morning heard a blog, a podcast, an Australian podcast about the energy transition happening very, very fast in Australia. And they kept referring to the UK and how the UK, they felt sorry for the people in the UK because of what's going on. But that just very briefly, last year, so in the sort of late, I would say about a year and about 14 months ago, I won't mention any of the people involved, but I was at an energy company, and one of the people I was waiting to interview had a kind of group Zoom call with the then energy minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, and 10 old white men who were the bosses of EDF, British Gas, whatever they were, all the energy companies. And I didn't hear anything. So he turned off the mic and the camera and just showed me this laptop screen, which was basically a load of angry white blokes shouting at a black man and pointing right like that. And what I was told was they had all been saying to the government since May of 2021, so almost a year before the Ukraine invasion by Russia, gas prices are going to go off the scale. There's going to be an energy crisis in the winter of 2022. We've got to do something about this now. We need to start preparing for this. Let's do something. And by the time I saw it was like 6 months later, and the government had done nothing, absolutely nothing. And now then Putin invaded Ukraine, which obviously made everything worse. But I just want to keep pointing out that wasn't out of the blue. There was stuff happening before that happened, and the kind of frustration of that easy excuse, oh, well, gas prices have gone up because of the Russian invasion. They were going to go up anyway, and no one did it. And also, we're so reliant on gas in this country, and it makes me, sorry, I just had to have that little froth. But your explanation of why, I would love you to kind of do a précis of your explanation as to why it's so frustrating when you buy your energy from a renewable energy company, but your electricity costs go off the scale.
Yeah, well, so there's lots of things to unpack in here. So let's kind of rewind a little bit. So one of the questions, Australians on a podcast talking about the UK and, oh, geez, poor guys up there having a hard time. Why is the UK doing so badly, if you like? Why is the UK so exposed to what is, it's not just high UK gas prices. Gas prices are high, have gone up
Everywhere.
everywhere. But the UK is, almost uniquely exposed to high gas prices, and that's for a number of reasons. Basically, the UK's homes, 85% of them are heated with gas.
Yeah.
That's very high. Somewhere like the Netherlands is similar, but most European countries are much, much lower. So,
Right.
So France or Germany, well below 50% of homes use gas for heating. The European average, again, is much lower.
Right.
Then, on top of that, you've got the fact that the UK's housing stock is old and leaky.
Yeah.
We're not unique in having old housing stock, but we are fairly unique in having failed again and again over the last decades to actually make progress on making them less leaky, more cozy, to, and cheaper to run. So energy efficiency policy has just been a total void for a long time. And then on top of that, the UK gets a very high proportion of its electricity from gas as well. So like 40% of our electricity comes from gas. And again, places like Germany and France, way, way, way below that. Right. And so we kind of got this triple whammy, which means when there's high gas prices, we're incredibly exposed to that. And that's obviously a big problem. And then on top of that, there's the issue you mentioned, which is that electricity prices across the board are set. It's basically called it's the marginal generator. So if demand increases, another power station has to switch on, and the last one to switch on, the marginal generator, sets the price for all of the electricity sold during that settlement period. So each half hour, effectively, you kind of settle up, and the demand and the supply is balanced, and we pay for all of that. Now that's not unique to the UK. That's common to other European countries. But the fact is that gas sets the price for electricity in the UK basically the whole time, because such a high proportion of our electricity comes from gas. So even if it's a windy day and we've got lots of cheap renewable electricity coming onto the grid, gas still sets the price of electricity.
Right. That is actually, I hadn't thought of that, because there was a day recently I think we just knocked 62% of our electricity demand on a weekday, on a normal working day, was from wind.
Yeah.
But the price, and I checked on my Octopus, app that tells you the wholesale price. It was low. It was about 15 pence a kilowatt hour for that half hour.
Yeah.
Whereas quite often it's 55, 60 pence a kilowatt. So it was much lower than normal, but it wasn't zero, which it does.
Yeah.
But that is fascinating then. So even though at that point, a majority of our power is coming from offshore wind, the rest of it was being made up by gas. And the last gas plant that was switched on was the most expensive, and that's what we paid.
Yeah. So even if it's only a small percentage, as long as there is a gas plant switched on somewhere, and assuming that's the marginal plant, which is usually the case, then that's going to set the price. So a lot of people sort of look at that and say, "Guys, this is crazy. Like, why are we doing it like that?" I mean, I think there are quite good, that is the way a lot of markets, not just electricity markets, are organised, and there's a reason it's ended up like that. It's not actually crazy. Like, it might sound crazy, but in the present circumstances, it looks a bit crazy, but it isn't. But also, the government is consulting on, is there a different way we could do this?
Yeah,
and particularly not just now, but particularly as we head towards 2035, when the government wants to have a completely clean electricity grid. Is there when say 70, 80 or even more percent of our electricity each year will be coming from renewables, and obviously their output varies according to the weather. Is there a different way that we need to organise the market in order to kind of best accommodate that shift? But the thing is that's a really big question. Like that's fundamentally rewiring the electricity market. And if you're going to want to do that, you're doing it at a time when we also need absolutely massive investment in the electricity system.
Yes.
And if you do big disruptive change in the electricity market at the same time as asking investors to pour billions of pounds into investing in it, when they don't know what the market's going to look like, that's disruptive. So that's kind of the conundrum that the government's facing at the moment. Like, how can they do that? What would be the best option? How to do it, and can they actually implement it without completely screwing up meeting our targets?
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting is the kind of parallels between that and, an industry I now know better than I ever thought I would, the automotive industry. The pain and distress of this disruptive change. It's really, the more I've looked at it and the more people in that industry I've spoken to, the harder that transition is. There was a period of sort of 2012 to 2015 where a lot of car companies made some electric vehicles that are cleaner and greener, and they have leaves painted on the side of them. And they only made a few hundred, so but meanwhile they made 111 million diesel cars, at the same time, which they didn't talk about being green. And now they are actually starting to, because they have to, because of what's happened in the market, produce a lot of electric vehicles, Volkswagen being a very good example. It's very painful for them not to, how to do that transition. And I always, it's one thing I think I've got right from the very early time I spoke about this was, this is really going to hurt, this transition. There's a lot of things that we take for granted are going to be,
and of
not
course,
going to work in the same way.
The Volkswagen story is super interesting because effectively they only did it because they were in a huge heap of doo-doo following the Dieselgate scandal, where they'd been cheating the regulations on exhaust pollution.
Yeah.
And effectively they were like, okay, how are we going to get out of this? Yeah. And I think it may even have been part of their settlement with the US government that they actually had to put a lot of money into
infrastructure. Absolutely, which they have done. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
But one of the things that I think is, it's kind of funny and a bit sad is what we're still seeing. We've seen this resurgence in the UK of newspaper articles and comment pieces pushing back on the transition to cleaner, cheaper, cars, electricity and so on. And a lot of them have just totally they've just missed the memo. And the global car industry is moving to electric cars.
Yes, it is.
The fact that major car markets like the UK have said there's going to be a ban in 2030 on internal combustion engines. Yeah. Obviously, that's part of the reason that the industry's moving. But that boat has sailed. Now that is the direction things are going, and it's happening a lot quicker than a lot of people thought. Yeah. There's literally no chance of turning the clock back. You can't suddenly say, "Oh, do you know what, guys? We think this is going to be expensive or whatever." We'd actually quite like to still be driving diesel cars, in 2035, 2040, whatever. You're not going to be able to buy those cars because the car makers are not going to be making them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just a very strange state of affairs that people think that there's still an argument to be won there. That's very much over.
Yeah, and I mean I think that same thing has happened. The shift I've seen, and this is really very anecdotal, but the number of people that I know who are of my age who've got a bit of spare cash, they're not spending it on a cruise or on a new garden house. They're spending it on solar, batteries, heat pumps. I mean, it is unbelievable, the level of this is, and I'm talking the comfortably off middle classes, and it's absolutely, any criticism is valid of those people. But they used to come to my house and go, God, what is all this nonsense? Looking at solar panels. Wow, that's spoilt the look of the roof. And why have you got that? What's that? A battery? What does that do? Stupid. They don't do that anymore.
They want to know how. They want to know how you did it.
How I did it, who can install it. They don't even ask how much it costs. They're doing it anyway,
Yeah.
And there's some particular friends in, I won't say, and they're not public people, but they're extraordinarily wealthy. Let's just leave it at that. And I saw their house a few days ago, and what they've done is absolutely, I didn't know you could even do it. I mean, to the level they've done it. So ground source heating, but to a level where they could probably have a warm house for 2 months with a total blackout. The sun's gone out. There's no power. Civil society is completely broken down, but their house would still be warm. They've got heat storage. I didn't even know that technology existed. And I'm in that world, batteries and solar and ground source. And it's extraordinary. And, that stuff is happening very, very fast. And I think the huge problem with that is normal people who've got normal jobs and normal houses that have been badly built over the last 70 years and are still being badly built now haven't got that opportunity to do that unless it's done collectively. And that's really kind of, in a way, a government task. But it can be done. We've seen new houses built where the average power bill still today is under £10 a month. And when you know that can happen, it's just like, how dare builders build I'm going to use expletives, a toll box with no insulation, gas heaters, and no charging for cars, no ground source heating, no battery, no solar. It's criminal. They should be arrested and punished.
I mean, I think what all of this goes to prove is that, this idea that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis is going to set back the clean energy transition. I mean, that's for the fairies.
No, it's exactly the opposite. Yeah,
absolutely. From the ground up, as you say it, individual people are saying, "Geez, how do we save gas this year? How can we cut our bills? Should we be thinking about solar panels?" Those conversations are happening. And absolutely, it's the case that it tends to be those that can afford it. That people have
to start with. Yes. Yeah.
But at the same time, that familiarity, a lot of these things are just unfamiliar, and people think, heat pump, what's that about? As soon as it is very much keeping up with the Joneses. They'll see their neighbours, they come around to your house, and hopefully other people's houses, and that they'll see, it just works, and that sense that all of the sort of scare stories that you can't heat your house with a heat pump, or it only works if you've insulated it up to the gills, all of those myths will effectively slip away. And the same with range anxiety, I guess with electric vehicles, that once people have a go and they're like, oh, this is quite fun to drive, and actually I can manage, there are enough charge points, and all of those shifts, at the kind of individual level, but also at the national level. I was looking just this morning at EU countries' targets for 2030 for their electricity systems. There are now 4 EU countries that are targeting 100% clean power by 2030.
Right.
Which may be news to Graham Stewart, the climate minister, who was going around the other day saying Labour's target to do that in the UK would basically send us all into poverty.
Right.
So perhaps he might like to talk to Austria and those other countries.
Yeah. Other well-known lefty communist countries like Austria.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. But not just those 4 countries are now going for 100% clean power. Basically, the vast majority of EU countries have raised their targets for 2030. Yeah. And the EU, therefore, as a whole, is heading towards 80% clean power by 2030. Right. Whereas a year ago, their target was kind of 10 percentage points lower, or something like that.
Yeah.
And so yes, we're probably going to burn a bit more coal this winter, but in terms of like the direction of travel, the speed, that's really shifted dramatically. I would say over the last 6 months.
Yeah. And also, I think what that does, and I've been witness to it very recently, is it absolutely spurs technological innovation. So people are coming up with, and that's what I think is exciting. I was invited, I think it was probably 20 years ago, to do a light-hearted talk at an energy conference in Birmingham, which is mainly sort of the big generating companies and the National Grid and all those people to do. It's like an after dinner. And I was doing it about Scrap Heap Challenge, the show I used to do on Channel 4. And I could tell when I didn't attend the conference, I only arrived in the evening, but it just looked so dull and it's so uninteresting. And I was so glad I hadn't been there all day. And the people looked quite depressed. And I've since attended some energy conferences more recently in the last sort of 5 years that are the most incredible buzz and vibrancy and excitement, and young people joining that industry because there's enormous amounts of change going on, and it's really exciting. And will this work? And can we do all? That change, I think, is going to accelerate. That the innovations, the technological innovations, the way you can have a battery in your house, or your car can charge your home, and your home can charge, all those things are happening. So it's a kind of dizzying.
The other thing is, you mentioned National Grid. I think this is one of the untold stories of the transition, and in a way, the UK is kind of a real leader on this. That one of the number one criticisms of wind and solar is, oh well, okay, they might be cheap. Finally, we're going to admit that they probably are cheaper. And okay, maybe it'll allow us to cut our gas imports because we've got homegrown energy here. And okay, maybe there might be some jobs, and they are quite popular. Yeah, all of those things are true. But what about the intermittency? Oh, you can't rely on wind and solar because what about when it isn't windy? And by the way, have you noticed the sun sets every night?
Yes.
And the great thing is that in the UK, National Grid, the electricity system operator, which has kind of been hived off from National Grid, the commercial company, they're just actually getting on with this. So
Yeah.
they've set their own target of 2025 to be able to run the grid for short periods without any fossil fuels.
Right.
And they're not just kind of aspiring to that. They're actually going out, they're contracting, and they're saying to, clever electrical engineers and, innovators in that area, we need XYZ kind of technical capabilities in order to be able to switch off some gas power plants. So we need things like, like system inertia, like voltage control, frequency response. So if the wind suddenly drops, and that means that changes the voltage on the system, we need something to be able to respond to that quickly. So they've just set out like a list of all of these technical, geeky kind of electrical engineering requirements to keep the grid stable and to keep it running. And they've just put out contracts, and they've bought. They are already buying those capabilities, and they're just getting on with it. And I really encourage people to look into this. Basically, engineers are pretty smart, and problems that seem insurmountable, and indeed, for many years, people said, "Oh, you can't possibly have more than 10% of your electricity coming from wind because that's just impossible. It's just going to destabilize the grid, and we're going to end up having blackouts." Well, guess what? Now we're up to like 40%, renewables in the UK, on average, and on some days, as you said, like 60% wind, and it works already. And that, the innovation, as you say, just going on behind the scenes there is, is actually staggering. And it kind of gives me confidence that, now we're talking about by 2030, maybe sort of 70-80% clean, or 70-80% renewable, but ultimately, there's this idea, okay, sure, we might get 70 or 80% wind and solar because they are cheapest, but we're probably going to need a bunch of other stuff to back them up effectively. And that might be nuclear, it might be gas with CCS, it might be like hydrogen turbines, all sorts of things that are, also definitely could work. But actually, I think that envelope is going to shrink, and the idea that like with EVs, like the idea that they couldn't do certain things, and as batteries have got better and better, suddenly we can have heavy haulage vehicles with battery electric, and in the same way, I think that space that apparently can't be filled with cheap wind and solar is going to shrink.
Yeah. And that's the last topic, because I do really just want to cover this, because you did mention it then and I'd forgotten, but there is hydrogen. So I'll do my brief history of hydrogen. I think I was 7 or 8 years old when I was at a cinema with my dad, probably to see The Great Escape war film or something. And there was a Pathé newsreel, which I think had a rover. This car runs on hydrogen. This will be the fuel of the future. So I'm 66 years old. So that was 59 years ago. So I can't even work out when it was, a long time ago. And I'm still waiting. And we've just heard that and I went to see it when it opened, and we filmed it. We've done an episode about it. The ITM Power hydrogen refueling station at Cobham Services on the M25.
Which is now closed, right?
Which is gone. There's not even a trace of it. It's just bare earth. It's been it's just not there. So that side of it. But the fact that certainly over the last 12 years since I've been making Fully Charged, hydrogen has come and gone. There's been times when no one mentions it. No one on Twitter, there's no comments going, well, this is all well and good, but hydrogen is the future. But it's just come back into vogue. And I think partly because of our environment. I can't believe he's our environment minister, whatever he is. The tall streak of Victorian.
Yeah.
I can't even say.
So the business secretary,
is that what he is? Oh, goodness.
Business energy and industrial strategy, yeah.
Right. Oh, God. Oh, Christ. Because I know people who work in that department. They must be. I don't even want to know. But I actually did a tweet that I felt really sorry for engineers and scientists working on fusion, because he just said that's the future, which means there's no chance it's ever going to work. Just not. It was a joke. I don't mean it. But that, I don't know where you see that. I mean, I've had a lot of discussions recently about hydrogen in one aspect, and the reality of carbon capture and storage, which I think is a critical element of the hydrogen sales pitch that the fossil fuel industry is spouting out. Because they're going to supply it. That's the whole reason it's being pushed so hard. It is. I thought it was 95% of available hydrogen today was from natural gas, was steam reformed out of natural gas. And Michael Liebreich, who I'm sure you've heard of, corrected me once. No, that's not right. He's so fierce. I'm always frightened when I speak to him. I said, oh God, I thought I'd exaggerated. No, it's not 95, it's 98%.
I was going to say it must be like 99, right? Yeah, it's up there.
It's very close to 100. So there's an obvious, remit there that the reason hydrogen is in the news, and it's such an easy. I want it to work. I want that we develop a culture and engineering and systems that use hydrogen sensibly in realistic ways. Because it's clearly, I've always said, if I was cycling down a road and a diesel car overtakes me, I don't want to breathe in what that's coming out. And if a hydrogen car overtakes me, I don't care, unless I slip on all the water coming out of the exhaust.
I mean, it's actually an underappreciated point about hydrogen. Depending on the way the burner, it actually can produce NOx, like oxides of nitrogen. Which
yes,
I mean, it is
if you burn it,
yeah. Obviously, if it's a fuel cell, you don't get that.
No.
Yeah, so hydrogen, I mean, it's a tricky one. As you say, there have been a series of hype cycles around hydrogen where, we're kind of in the midst of one at the moment. I feel like in a way it's sort of abating a little bit, but obviously we do have now like, UK targets for, is it now 10 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2030? Wow. Big targets in the EU. And I think when people think of hydrogen, they immediately think cars. Yeah. And I think what is abundantly clear at this point, if it wasn't...
That's not going to happen. Yes.
To be honest, it's been abundantly clear for a very long time, and some people just haven't realised, companies like Toyota, for example.
Yeah.
But it's been abundantly clear for a long time that hydrogen cars are very much not going to happen.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, there may well be a very important role for hydrogen in the journey to net zero. And so one of the things, we did a big kind of Q&A about hydrogen a couple of years ago. And I'm, kind of delighted to say I think it holds up very well in terms of, nothing's happened since then to make me think, oh God, I wish we hadn't written that. That looks a bit embarrassing. No, it's very much stand by what we wrote, and I'll share a link so you can put it in the notes.
Oh, good, please do. Yeah.
But if effectively, people talk about hydrogen as, someone described it as like a Swiss Army knife, which effectively means you can do pretty much anything with hydrogen. So anything that we currently do with natural gas, with methane, you can do the same thing with hydrogen. It's just a gas. It's a vector. It's a way of transporting energy. It's not a source of energy, of course. That's important. We don't just pluck it out of the sky. We have to make it from something. But you can burn it. You can heat your house. You can run your car. You can run a chemicals plant. Lots of those things that we currently use methane for, you can do with hydrogen. But like a Swiss Army knife, you can do anything with a Swiss Army knife. It just isn't that great for any of those tasks, right? So the point about hydrogen is you basically reserve it for the things where you really don't have an alternative, right? So where you've got a puncture at the side of the road and you absolutely have to use a spoon to get the tire off your bike, you kind of stuck with it, right? So if you look at like the IPCC report that came out, and the last bit of which came out this year, what they say about hydrogen is effectively hydrogen is really important to get to 1.5 degrees, but it's basically for the stuff where we can't electrify.
Yeah.
So if you can electrify, that will be way more efficient, like 3, 4, 5 times more efficient in terms of the energy system that you need to get the stuff that you want, which is a thing that moves you around or a warm house. And therefore, if you can electrify it, because it's so much more efficient, it's likely to be cheaper too. But nevertheless, there might be some niches where hydrogen is incredibly important. And that, so one thing might be where we need the molecules, right? The actual H2 themselves, and that's like fertilizers, certain bits of the chemical industry. You need hydrogen, so you better make sure it's clean hydrogen. Other areas where you might need it is like, for example, shipping. There's not that many ways to, you can't ship hundreds of containers around halfway around the world on a battery. Of course, like electric ferries are, taking off in a big way. But for those long distances, you're never going to do that with a battery. And so something like hydrogen or derivatives thereof, so ammonia or methanol, they may well be part of the solution. It may be part of the solution for flights.
Yeah.
There may be long distance trucking in certain situations where that may be fuel cells. But if you look at, I saw some really interesting out of China recently, where the electric vehicle market is just absolutely soaring, and even in trucks, so heavy trucks, it's really starting to take off now. And if you look at the split between electric trucks versus fuel cell trucks, because in theory China is one of the places going hard on hydrogen, but actually fuel cell trucks are still a tiny fraction of the electric vehicle trucks.
Right.
So across the board, like all of these areas where we thought hydrogen's going to play a really big role, actually it will play maybe a niche role, but that doesn't mean we don't need any of it. It might be vital, but it's just going to have a very small role to play. And I think similarly, if you look at hydrogen for heating, it's been part of the conversation in the UK for a long time now as, decarbonising heat is difficult. It's people's homes. It's very personal. We don't want to disrupt things. Heat pumps are disruptive. They don't work that well, blah, blah, blah. And all of these kind of myths start slipping away.
Yeah.
And I think the consensus is very much shifting towards actually the bulk of homes will be on a heat pump because innovation and prices will come down. And the performance is better than people think, and the disruption is not as great as you thought. And the fundamental challenge with hydrogen for heat is you can't just do the odd house here and there in the way that you can with a heat pump. First of all, there isn't any clean hydrogen, as you said. It's all it's all dirty hydrogen. So if you put in a hydrogen boiler and you run it on hydrogen, that's way worse than a gas boiler in terms of emissions right today. And second of all, like if you want to get to the point where like a whole town or even a city is converted to hydrogen, that's like a really big hurdle. That takes a brave politician to say, do you know what? Everyone in this city is going to have a hydrogen boiler. Now, I don't care, guys. Maybe you don't like the idea, but that's just what we're going to do. Street to street, house to house, in the way that we went from town gas historically to natural gas, as we call it. That was done on a systematic basis, and people didn't have a choice about it. That was just imposed on them, and effectively, you would have to do that for hydrogen heat as well. Even if it's only at the scale of cities, and if you're talking about the whole country, it's a massive project, and you would have to be confident as a government minister to make that decision that we were going to do that. So I think for that reason alone, just the practical hurdle to making it happen, I think it's ultimately not going to play a huge role.
Yeah, and I promise we will finish soon, but I've just got to cover carbon capture and storage. Again, I saw a carbon capture system at Imperial College 12, 15 years ago. And I'm sure it worked. And it was an experimental one that they were working on. But it's just one of those casually tossed aside comments. Well, obviously, we're going to use natural gas to produce the hydrogen, but we'll capture the carbon and we'll store it in underground caves where we've extracted gas along the past. Well, those underground caves all leaked. One thing, we know that. And then I don't know. I mean, am I being too cynical? Is carbon capture and storage a realistic, plausible, economically viable solution? If it worked we could run gas plants and capture all the carbon coming out of them, that's got to be better than not doing it.
So I would say that the carbon capture and storage, like the conception of how carbon capture and storage fits in the story of how we get to zero emissions or net zero emissions has really shifted. And it used to be very much talked about as it's all right, we can keep burning coal to generate electricity because we'll just put carbon capture on it. People might remember the protests over Kingsnorth power station where they were going to build a new coal plant there, and eventually it all got dropped. But that new coal plant was going to be a carbon capture and storage plant, and it never got built. And the idea that we would have hundreds or even thousands of coal-fired power stations around the world with carbon capture stuck on them, that's basically gone out the window.
Right.
The reason being, first of all, there have been a few projects where they've tried to do it, and it's proven more challenging than was hoped. And second of all, the cost of the alternatives has plummeted. So at the time when wind and solar were expensive and people were sceptical that the costs would come down in the way that they have, it might have been reasonable to say, okay, well, carbon capture and storage is difficult. It might be quite expensive, but it might be the only option, effectively.
Yeah.
But now wind and solar are so cheap, it's about like, well, okay, we're going to definitely get the vast majority of electricity from those. Is there still a role for carbon capture around the margins in the power sector? Perhaps. And then, is there a role for carbon capture in other areas? So particularly industry. And I think this is again, it's a bit like hydrogen, where there are some niches where we don't yet have alternatives.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about cement, if you're talking about certain kind of process heat for the chemical industry where you need a very high temperature, you basically need to use something like hydrogen or carbon capture, or someone needs to come up with an alternative. Yeah. And so, and making clean hydrogen is one of these niches that in theory is going to be met with carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
Of course, with hydrogen, you can make it with electricity too, and that can be clean electricity from renewables. And in theory, that's more expensive at the moment. Except suddenly, the fuel for making for making blue hydrogen, so-called from gas, is the gas, and it's very expensive. So the idea that blue hydrogen is going to be cheap relative to green hydrogen is suddenly looking quite shaky. Yeah. The other kind of remaining argument for why you might continue to pursue blue hydrogen is simply because the pace of expansion of renewables, if we're going to decarbonize not just the electricity system, but also the whole energy system, and that means massively increasing the size of the electricity system, we just have to build so much wind and solar so quickly that there might be a case for saying, well, we kind of need everything we can get our hands on, and maybe blue hydrogen is part of the answer to that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think I agree with you very strongly. Simon, it's been amazing talking to you. We've gone well over the hour, which, as I always promise it will be, well, we've gone 3 minutes over the hour. But I've enjoyed talking to you hugely. It's been a real privilege. And please come back.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. It's been fascinating. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I'd love to come back. Yeah, that'd be great.
Really hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was really fascinating and informative. What a dude. Amazing. Really do want to get him to come to Fully Charged Live to talk on some panels there or do some presentations there. Would be great next year. Proper clever people are impressive when they're not kind of showing off, which Simon clearly doesn't. He's just a really nice man. That's all. Do have a look at the MyEnergy website. Have a look at the products they're pushing out now, because they are amazing. I can't wait to get my big filthy mix on some of their new stuff from Lincolnshire. Please do subscribe to the show. Please do tell your friends about the Fully Charged Show and the amazing people we get on here, and tell them to subscribe, and have a look at Patreon if you want. No pressure at all. It's only if you feel like supporting what we're doing. The podcast is going from strength to strength, which is fantastic. The live show are incredible. 6 of them next year, right across the year and right around the world. And the YouTube channel is going gangbusters, I think it's fair to say. We're well over 1 million views a week, which is just amazing, and it keeps growing. And we'll reach 1 million subscribers, I think, sometime early next year, which is amazing. It's been an incredible journey. So that's all. Please do join me again next week when there'll be another freshly minted episode. If you have been, thank you for listening.